I stood outside my house on the night of my 18th birthday, with a bag of torn clothes and nowhere to go. They called it teaching me a lesson in life. But 7 years later, when they opened the door to the house they were renting, I was standing inside, keys in hand. Little did they know, they were renting the house from the person they had thrown out like trash that day. Welcome to Twisted Justice, where seemingly tragic stories become a bell of justice, where those who despise you will sooner or later taste the bitter truth. If you love satisfying revenge, turning the tables on your opponents, then you've come to the right place. Click subscribe to not miss suffocating stories like this every week. And today, I'm going to tell you a story in which I am the main character. A story that began with betrayal from those I once called family, and ended with a door opening, not for me to enter, but for them to bow down and enter my place of power. I wasn't born into luxury, but I didn't expect to start my life as a homeless person on my 18th birthday. My family, especially my stepfather, always saw me as a burden. My mother, she loved him more than a mother would love her own child. I remember that night so clearly, my birthday. No cake, no candles, no one remembered. They waited until I turned 18 to make the announcement. I had to leave the house. They said I was old enough to fend for myself, that this was the best way for me to learn how to grow up. The truth was, they just wanted to get me out of their lives for good. I had no money, no other family to rely on, and absolutely no plans for my future. The only thing I had was anger and a determination to never let myself be dumped again. But before you think this is a story of lament or pity, let me warn you, this is a story of a karmic reversal, where the very people who put me in the hole are living under my roof. They don't know it. No one else does, until it's too late. I was silent. I disappeared. But I kept watching. I watched their lives from afar. I knew they weren't doing much better. They were down. They were in debt. And then, when I found out they were desperately looking for a place to rent, I decided, this is where the game begins. I bought the house. I put it in someone else's name. I kept my mouth shut. And when they moved in, I stayed hidden. I watched every rent payment they sent. Their money flowing into my account. I knew the day of every leaky faucet. The day they asked for a rent reduction because the air conditioner was broken. They called the landlord, not knowing that I was the one who took those calls through the property manager. And then, one day, I showed up. No warning, no introduction. I just opened that door, walked into the living room where they were sitting eating dinner as if everything in their lives was fine, and said one sentence, "We meet again. This time, in my house." If you're feeling shocked, don't worry. You haven't heard the best part yet. Because behind that revenge was a journey of rebuilding my life from scratch. There were nights sleeping in a warehouse, months working 2 or 3 jobs to survive, and times when I almost gave up. But I didn't. I turned my pain into motivation. I used their coldness as fuel to become someone they could never control again. They thought they had thrown me away, but in reality, they had just freed me from the very prison of my toxic family that I would never dare leave. And when they thought they had won, when they sat in that house, complaining about the old hardwood floors or the high electricity bill, they had no idea that it was me who heard it all, knew it all, and controlled it all. This is not just a story of betrayal. This is a message to everyone who has ever been trampled on, who has been rejected, who has been abandoned. You can be pushed to the bottom, but you can also rise from there, build a house of your own, or like me, buy back the very place they pushed you out of. Are you ready to hear the whole story? Hit subscribe and brace yourself, because what's next is even more brutal than they thought. I grew up in a small house in the western suburbs of the city, where people thought life was peaceful and stable. But behind that door, there was not the warm laughter of a happy family, but endless quarrels, cold eyes, and painful indifference. My mother was a very strong woman. She raised me alone until I was 11 years old. After my father left without a word of goodbye, I used to think that as long as I had my mother, I would be fine. But then she met him, David, the man I call stepfather. Although I never acknowledged it in my heart, David was the type of person that everyone would think, kind, decent, working regularly, knowing how to take care of his wife and children. But to me, he was a nightmare in the form of a father. From the beginning, David did not like me. He considered me a thorn in his side, living proof that my mother had a different life before meeting him. And the worst part was that my mother gradually changed. She started to be silent when David yelled at me, even when he broke a glass and blamed me for spilling the water. At first I thought she just wanted to avoid arguing, but over time, I realized she was no longer on my side. I don't know if it was because she loved him too much, or if she was simply tired of being a single mother. Whatever the reason, I, her only son, became a stranger in my own home. There were no family vacations in my childhood, no proper birthday parties. I learned to cook when I was 13, because I knew no one would if I didn't do it myself. Every time I tried to ask my mother for something for school, she would glance at David as if waiting for his opinion. And he always had the same answer: he can handle it. Don't make him any weaker. Gradually, I learned a bitter lesson. No one came to save me. There was no real family in my world. There was just me and my self-esteem that I had to hold on to if I didn't want to drown. I wasn't the best student in school, but I worked hard. I started working part-time jobs at the age of 16. Washing dishes in restaurants, serving coffee, anything that would help me save some money in case things got out of hand. I always had a feeling that the day I would be pushed out onto the street would come. And it did come just as I expected. The people around me, my mother, Linda, the woman who used to hold me in her arms when I cried as a child, now became the silent one who watched me being thrown out of the house. She wasn't ugly, but she was weak. And that weakness killed our mother-son relationship. David, my stepfather, the one who held the power in the family, he didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beat me. With just his cold eyes and words, he made me feel like an extra, a game changer, step by step pushing me away from the place I once called home. My half-sister, Natalie, was 3 years older than me, but she never stood by me. She lived in another city and occasionally came home for the holidays. She never listened to my explanations, always thinking I was a rebel who made my mother suffer. Later, she would indirectly help me get that house. But at that time, she was an outsider, not wanting to get involved in family drama. When you live in an environment where people see you as an outsider, you learn to defend yourself. I couldn't complain to my friends because I was ashamed. I also didn't want them to pity me. So I tried to study, work extra, and save. Not because I had a specific plan, but simply because I needed a way out. And then my 18th birthday came. I remember it clearly. I came home from work that afternoon, still wearing my restaurant apron. When I entered the house, I saw my suitcase, already packed by my mother, sitting at the door. David was reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened, and my mother looked at me with empty eyes. "You're old enough. From now on, you have to learn to be independent. We can't protect you forever." Protect me? They never did. But I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. I just bowed my head, picked up my suitcase, and walked out of that house without looking back. That was the beginning of a journey I never imagined. I slept in the warehouse of the restaurant where I worked for the first few weeks. After that, I moved in with a friend. I worked day and night, learned to make ends meet, and was determined never to let anyone have the power to kick me out of home again. In my heart, there is one thing that never goes out. I will come back, but next time, I will be the one holding the key. You know the situation. A guy abandoned by his own family rises from the ashes and vows not to let them forget that mistake. But the story has only just begun. You want to know what happened next? What happened to them? How did I turn things around? I left that house with a suitcase, a few clothes, and about $83 in my bank account. No one in my family saw me off. No one asked where I was going, how I was going to live. My mother just kept repeating the same thing. You need to learn to be independent, as if I were a kid who had never cooked for myself, never worked after school, never filled up the gas in the old car I had saved up to buy from a friend. I didn't know what I should feel. Anger, hurt, despair? Probably all of them. But deep down I knew. None of these emotions would save me from having to survive day by day. I had to find a way to hang on. Even if it was in a friend's basement or sleeping on a chair in the store after my night shift. Luckily, the owner of the restaurant where I worked as a waiter was the first to reach out. He let me sleep in the back storage room, joking that, "Just don't let anyone see you come out of here in the morning." I was more grateful to him than anyone else at the time, while my mother and David had thrown me out on the street without a second thought. A stranger had reached out to help me survive. From that moment on, I decided I was going to be the person they never imagined I would be. Not to prove them wrong, but to make sure I never found myself in the position of being banished so cruelly again. The early years. Learning to live like no one was supporting me. I worked all sorts of jobs. Night shifts at restaurants, delivering pizza on weekends, and online classes during the day. I didn't have enough money to go to college right away, but I looked for free courses on investing, personal finance, and real estate. I was obsessed with the concepts of assets and cash flow. While surfing YouTube at night, I came across a segment about how rich people don't work for money. They let money work for them. That became my guiding principle. I started saving every penny. No luxury goods, no fancy meals, no dates. Because everyone thought I was weird and secretive. They didn't know I was secretly formulating a survival plan in my head. I joined local real estate groups, got to know older people in the industry, listened to them talk about the housing market like they were telling war stories. They looked at me like I was a kid, but I persevered. I became an errand boy for a brokerage firm, making copies, driving people to show houses, taking notes, as long as I could learn. A broker named Carlos took me on as an unofficial apprentice. He said, "I've never seen a 19-year-old with the eyes of someone who's lived through 3 wars. I didn't tell him why, but he knew something inside me was burning. First reunion. Their negligence opens the way for me. I was 21 when I first saw my mother and David after the eviction. I ran into them at an open house, where I was working as a support for Carlos. They had come with a different agent, looking for a rental because of financial difficulties after David lost his job. I was standing across the room, holding a file, when David's eyes caught mine. I saw him hesitate for a moment, then turn away, as if I didn't exist. My mother saw me then. She looked much older. Her hair was grayer, and her eyes were more vacant than I remembered. No one said a word, but most importantly, they were looking for a rental. That meant they had moved out of the house. Why? I didn't know. It could have been a sale to pay off debts. It could have been a transfer. It could have been anything. But that moment planted a seed in my head. If they were looking for a place to rent, and I was on my way to becoming a real estate owner, was there a loop starting to turn? The first investment, and a fateful coincidence. At 22, with savings, a few loans, and Carlos's guarantee, I bought my first house. It was a single-family home, old, close to the city center, but with potential. I rented each room to students, fixed the bathroom, painted the walls, and did the gardening myself. The money started to flow in. Not much, but steady. I reinvested immediately. Then one day, as I was scrolling through the repossession listings, I saw a familiar name, The old address, the house I had been evicted from. The listing clearly stated. The owner could no longer pay the second mortgage, and the house was up for auction. My heart was pounding. I called Carlos. I asked him if we could auction the house. He laughed. "Do you still have feelings for it?" I didn't answer. How could I explain that the house was a scar I would always carry? The phone calls that led to the big fight. I won the auction. I bought the house for less than market value because of the complicated legal situation. I hired a lawyer to clean up the mess, and after nearly 5 months, the house was officially in my name. At this point, I discovered that my mother and David were still living there as illegal tenants, according to the old lease. I sent them a notice to negotiate a new lease under my name. The moment David called me, I could hear the tremor in his voice that he tried to hide. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We're family." I didn't know whether to laugh or be angry. Family? When they pushed me out on the street when I was 18. When they never called to ask if I was alive or dead. When he was the one who said, "It's best if he leaves soon, so the house doesn't get crowded." I didn't answer his call. I just sent a clear email. They could stay, but they had to pay fair market rent, and the lease would be professionally drawn up. If they didn't pay by the end of the term, I would proceed with legal eviction proceedings. My mother called, and for the first time she begged. She called me late one night. I saw her name on the phone screen, and my heart pounded as if my childhood had come back. I picked up. Her voice wasn't as cold as it had been when I was 18. It was shaky, weak. She asked me to reduce the rent, saying that David was sick and she wasn't making any money. She didn't sound like a mother. She sounded like someone who was afraid of losing her place to live. I was silent for a long time. Then I said, "I begged you not to put me out on the street. Remember?" She was silent. I continued, "I won't evict you, but you have to sign the contract. And don't expect any exceptions. If you were a normal tenant, you wouldn't expect the landlord to be lenient, right?" She simply said, "I'm sorry." The 3 words I had been waiting for 10 years. But the conflict didn't stop there. David refused to sign the contract. He called me, banged on the table, called me ungrateful, a poisonous snake, and swore that he would sue me for buying the house behind your back. I laughed. The contract was in his mother's name. The loan was in default. The bank was repossessing. The law was on my side. I sent a letter with an attorney attesting. If they didn't sign, I would follow the procedure. A court date was set. And guess what? That was the day I put on my first suit. Walked into the courtroom as the property owner, suing the very person who had evicted me. That's how it started. Not with a fight, but with a power shift. They used to have the power to decide whether I stayed or went. Now, I had the power to set conditions, sign contracts, or decide to end any deal. But I didn't do it out of revenge. At least not in the usual way. I wanted them to feel powerless, inferior, and dependent. The same way I had felt throughout my youth. And what about the confrontation in court? And what happened next that led to the final climax? Where I literally made them lose their heads. I sat in the courtroom that dreary morning, hands clasped, my suit still smelling of new fabric, but my mind was drifting back to that cold night years ago. The night I sat alone at the bus stop, clutching an old suitcase, while the porch light went out, cutting the last ties between me and them. It was different now. I was no longer the abandoned child. I was the plaintiff. I was the homeowner. Across the table, my mother sat beside David. She looked much smaller than the image that had dominated my childhood, but her eyes were no longer remorseful. Instead, there was a timidity mixed with confusion. David, on the other hand, still had his characteristic anger. The arrogant way of a man used to giving orders, now gritting his teeth to hear judgment from someone he had once considered useless. The courtroom conversation did not last long. All the papers were in order. The house that once belonged to them was legally purchased by me through a bank auction. I gave them the opportunity to sign a new lease. They refused. That was enough legal grounds to ask the court to order eviction. The judge looked at David and asked, "Do you have any evidence that the defendant still has the legal right to stay in this house?" David raised his head and pulled out a stack of papers. "I have a handwritten letter from the seller before the bank foreclosed. They agreed to let me stay for 3 more years without a lease." The judge picked it up and examined it. After a while, he looked up. "This letter is not legally valid after the property is seized by the bank. Did you know that?" David was startled, but forced himself to answer. "We didn't think he would become the owner. If we had known that it was my son, things would have been different." I looked at him. "The problem is, it was because you knew it was me that you didn't sign the contract." The room fell silent. The judge nodded and ordered that if I didn't vacate the house within 30 days, the authorities would take enforcement action. I won, but I wasn't happy, because as soon as I left the courthouse, another earthquake awaited me. A twist I'd never imagined. A piece of paper fell from a file cabinet, and the hidden truth emerged. The next day, I went to the lawyer's office to sign some final papers after the trial. The young assistant handed me a black folder containing copies of all the paperwork related to the house. Bank records, old mortgages, lawsuits, eviction documents, and an unopened envelope. "I found this falling out of the file the owner sent me," she said. "It must have been from the auction." I nodded, took it, and opened it. Inside was a copy of an old will, dated 2013, 2 years before I was evicted. I scanned the contents and froze. Testator: my grandmother, my mother's biological mother. Sole heir to the house: my name. I read it 3 times. It was correct. My grandmother, who had died a few years earlier, had left the house to me. Not to my mother, not to David, but to me. The scariest part? The will was notarized, signed, and perfectly valid. But it had never been made public. I had never heard of it. And the bank records showed the house was still in my mother's name, as if my grandmother had never owned it. I called my lawyer right away. He was silent for a long moment, then asked, "Are you sure that the will is real?" "I have it in my hand. So there's a good chance your mother hid it and forged the transfer procedures after your grandmother died." It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. They didn't just kick me out of the house. They stole my house from the start, revisiting the past, and the pieces of the puzzle shiver. I went back to rummaging through old memories. My grandmother lived with us until she died. She was the only person in the family who treated me with unconditional love. When I was little, she used to whisper, "From now on, this house is yours. I want you to have a place to stay out of the rain and sun, not to depend on anyone." I thought that was just her way of showing her love. But it turned out to be true. When she died, I was only 16. My mother held a quick funeral, then said she left nothing behind, because she had nothing to leave behind. I didn't ask any more questions. I believed her. Now it all became clear. My mother had hidden the will and had registered the house with David. Then, when I turned 18, barely an adult, they kicked me out. Legally, because my name wasn't on the papers. They thought I would never find out. Shocking facts. I became the victim of a family property takeover. I wasn't just someone who was accidentally evicted from my home. I was the victim of an internal fraud, disguised as family. Immediately, I hired a private investigator to reinvestigate the process of transferring the land title after my grandmother passed away. Every property declaration, every signature, every bank stamp was examined. 3 weeks later, I had enough evidence. A former employee at the local notary office confirmed. A valid will in my name had been sent, but then revoked by my mother just 3 days after the funeral, on the grounds that my grandmother changed her mind. There was no replacement. It was a scam. The biggest twist wasn't that I bought back the house they had evicted me from. It was that the house was mine from the start, and they'd deliberately hidden it to get it. The direct confrontation. And the truth was thrown right in their faces. I didn't email. I didn't call. I went straight to the house. They were still there, packed, ready to leave by court order. I walked into the yard, without knocking. David opened the door, about to scream, "Who gave you?" when I held up the copy of the will and the paperwork to prove it in front of him. "I didn't come to argue," I said. "I just want you two to read this." My mother took it, her eyes scanning it. When she realized it was my grandmother's signature, her hand shook. "This can't be. This is the original, notarized, and has a valid serial number. You two hid it, and this house should have been mine since I was 16. David blushed, snatching the paperwork as if to tear it to shreds. "Don't try to act like this," I said. "I have a lawyer. I have witnesses from the notary office. I have a bank seal. I can take you two to court for embezzlement and falsification of legal documents." The room seemed to stop breathing. I didn't say anything more. I just turned and walked away. Before I left, my mother called out to me, "What are you going to do?" I turned around and looked straight at her. "I'll let the law decide, but if you want to know how I feel, I used to think that buying this house was justice, but it turns out it wasn't justice. Justice is exposing the truth. It's letting everyone know what you did to your own child, with your own mother's last wishes." Shocking event. It's not just about the house. It's a betrayal of blood relations. I returned to my rented apartment and couldn't sleep that night. My anger had subsided. Instead, there was a feeling of emptiness, as if someone had just peeled off the last layer of skin that protected my heart. I had no hope for my family anymore. But what I did have was justice. My lawyer filed a lawsuit. The charges included forgery of legal documents, usurpation of inheritance, concealment of a legitimate will, and fraud of assets owned by the heir. The upcoming trial would no longer be about reclaiming the house. It would be about exposing the whole truth to justice. And the first twist was when I realized they thought I was a burden. They thought I would never rise again. But they themselves paved the way for me to step into the role of the person in power. And they didn't know. I didn't just get the house back. I got the truth they tried to bury. I never thought I would be back in court as a plaintiff again. But this time it was more than just a tenant eviction. It was time to get it all out. No more evasion. No more beating around the bush. I wasn't just asking for my house back. I was asking for justice, preparing for the final battle. After discovering the hidden will, my lawyer and I rushed to prepare our lawsuit. There was no ambiguity. My mother and David had deliberately hidden the legal will, forged the property transfer documents, and evicted me from the house that was rightfully mine. My lawyer, Mr. Patel, was a man who didn't shy away from going all the way. He had represented many complex inheritance disputes, and when I showed him the will, he simply said, "Now it's your turn to run the show." We filed a lawsuit against my mother and David for inheritance fraud, forgery of legal documents, concealment of wills, assets misappropriation, family breach of trust. In addition, I asked for financial damages for all the years I lost my inheritance, including rent I had to pay, living expenses when I was evicted, emotional damages, restraining order. The day of the trial, I was no longer a child in their eyes. On the day of the trial, they were all there, my mother, David, and their attorneys. But unlike the first time, they were not as calm as before. They knew if they lost, it would be more than just losing a house. They would lose their reputation, lose face in front of their entire family, and they could face criminal charges if the court found there was a criminal element in the forgery. I walked into the courtroom, no longer an 18-year-old kid who had been chased away in the night. I was an adult with records, evidence, a lawyer, and most of all, the truth on my side. The trial begins, and the first legal blow. My lawyer was the first to present. "Your Honor," Mr. Patel said, "we will show that Samantha Parker, my client's biological mother, deliberately concealed a valid will left by her mother, in which the property, the house at issue, was left to my client, Connor Parker. Samantha then abused her family relationship, falsified the transfer documents, and ultimately kicked Connor out of the house to which he was the rightful heir. He placed the notarized will on the table, along with the notary's investigation records, which confirmed that no replacement will have been filed after the original was executed. The first piece of evidence, the will, was a fatal blow. The opposing attorneys tried to argue that the will was out of date, but there was no replacement. No one could prove that my grandmother had changed her mind. My mother could not produce any documents to prove that she had ever legally received the property. The testimony, and the layers of mask falling off. My attorney called me to testify. I told her everything. The discrimination from my childhood, the coldness from my mother and David, the shock of being kicked out of the house on my 18th birthday. I told her about the night I slept at the bus stop, about the years I struggled to survive, and then the fateful auction that brought me back to that house. When I explained how I discovered the hidden will, the courtroom fell silent. After me came a witness, a former employee of the notary office, who confirmed that the will had been properly drawn up by my grandmother. But then someone claiming to be her daughter came to revoke it because she died suddenly and wanted to change it. They confirmed that the revocation signature matched my mother's. The second slap. The legal slap. Hard and straight to the face. A feeble protest. And a collapse in the dock. My mother's attorney began to argue, trying to prove that my mother's actions were just a misunderstanding. They said she thought the will was invalid because it had not been filed, that she had not intentionally hidden it, that she just wanted to keep the house and the family. I stood up. "I am family," I said, and they threw me out on the street. The court was silent. Then the judge turned to my mother. "Can you explain why you didn't tell your biological son about the will that left the house to him?" My mother bowed her head. David looked away. She just stammered. "I thought Connor wasn't mature enough. I was afraid he'd sell the house. So you kicked him out?" She was silent. The verdict and the complete collapse. A week later, the court issued its verdict. Confirmed the legal will. I am the official and sole heir of the house. The judgment that my mother's concealment and illegal use of assets is a serious violation, leading to legal consequences. Order my mother and David to pay a total of $275,000 in compensation, including legal fees, mental damage, and living expenses during the time I was not allowed to live in the house. Issue a restraining order. My mother and David are not allowed to come within 200 meters of my house for 5 years. Transfer the entire case to the prosecution agency to investigate the act of forgery and inheritance fraud. I walked out of the court like a person who had just regained his soul. The final revenge. I told everyone. I didn't stop there. I held a family meeting. I invited my aunts, uncles, and relatives who my mother had lied to me about me being disobedient and running away from home. When everyone was there, I turned on the projector, showed all the court documents, wills, testimonies, verdicts. Then I said, all this time, everyone thought I was an unfilial son. But now the truth is, I am the one who was betrayed. Everyone was shocked. Many hugged me and cried. One of my aunts, who had not spoken to me for 10 years, stood up, pointed at my mother and David. Shame on you too. The second climax, ending with rebirth. I did not force them out of the house. I did not use harsh words. I just used the truth and let the law do the rest. I fixed up the house, put everything back to the way my grandmother had kept it. Every painting, every corner of the yard bears the image of the person who once loved me unconditionally. And in front of my house, I hang a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "It is not blood that makes a family. It is honesty, love, and justice." A lesson in justice. It doesn't always come immediately, but it comes. There were nights when I wondered, was I wrong to take my mother to court? Was I unfilial to expose the truth? But then I realized, forgiveness does not mean staying silent in the face of wrongdoing. I forgive my mother, to a certain extent, because I understand that she is the product of unhealed wounds. But I cannot and should not forgive her for what she did. Because if I stay silent, I will continue that toxic chain. Justice does not come soon, but it comes when I am strong enough to receive it not with hatred, but with courage. I do not destroy them. I let the law do it. I do not scream at them. I won. I let the truth speak. That is the greatest lesson. When you have the truth in your hands, you do not have to scream. Not all relatives are family. After the family reunion, where I exposed the truth and let everyone see the real faces of my mother and David, I received many apologies. Some cried. Some told me I was brave. Some said, "We should have protected you from the beginning." But what touched me the most was a non-blood relative, my old neighbor Marlene, who had given me a few nights to stay after I was evicted, who called and said, "Connor, you can call this home now. But to me, you've been family since the night you knocked on my door for shelter from the rain." I realized, blood does not define family. Family is made up of people who don't leave you in your worst moments. No one has the right to write the ending of your life, except you. If you are watching this video and feel like you have been pushed aside, betrayed by your loved ones, hurt by the people who should have loved you the most, I want you to know, you are not alone, and you do not deserve this. What I went through was not a series of misfortunes. It was a journey that helped me understand who I am, how I want to live, and who I want to love with a healthy heart. You may not have control over where you were born, but you always have the right to decide who you become. Don't let anyone, whether they are called parents or family, take away your worth. They may push you out of your home, but if you maintain your kindness, your determination, and your belief in yourself, they can never push you away from your true destiny. That house, now a symbol of justice and new beginnings. I hung a small sign on my front porch, not to show off, but to remind myself, and anyone else who has gone through the same thing, that this is not just a house I took back. This is the honor I took back from the very people who tried to bury it. I started holding small gatherings at my house, for young people who had been rejected by their families. I cooked. I told stories. I listened. The house that had ended my childhood now began hope for others. An end, but not a full stop. My story is not about revenge. It's about standing up for yourself, reclaiming your voice when the rest of the world tells you to be silent. It's about losing everything, but if you maintain your integrity and kindness, you can still have it all. I was kicked out of my house on my 18th birthday. No apology, never looking back. But now, as I put the key in the old lock, hearing the soft click of the door opening, I smile. I don't need anyone's apologies anymore. I have found peace. A final message to you, the person watching this video. If you have ever been rejected, misjudged, or told you weren't good enough, remember this. Your true worth is not in how others treat you. It's in how you treat yourself. You may have been pushed out of the place you thought was home, but you can rebuild a new one with your own hands, your own will, and your own determination. Don't let the past decide the outcome. Let the truth and your courage write the end of the story. Because if I, a kid who was kicked out on the street with an old backpack, could stand up, fight, and reclaim myself, then so can you. They kicked me out of the house when I was 18. Now they have to send me rent every month. Justice sometimes is a nameplate on the door, bearing the name of the person who was betrayed. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a ray of light in the dark. Let's build a community of justice, honesty, and healing, where everyone has a right to belong.